You've done everything they told you to do. You put in the hours, you made good money, you show up prepared, you're polite, you try to get along with everyone around you, and still, in certain rooms, certain meetings, certain conversations, your word somehow carries less weight than you know it should. People talk over you. Your ideas get ignored until someone else repeats them. You work twice as hard as people who seem to coast on confidence you can't quite put your finger on. If that's where you are, you need to hear this. It's not your competence that's in question. It's the signal you're broadcasting. And according to a 2023 Pew Research survey, 72% of workers say they've been in situations where they knew more than the person speaking, yet chose to stay silent. So this isn't rare. This is a psychology problem, not a performance problem. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why that keeps happening and what specifically to change, starting with your self-image, not your to-do list. Here's the thing most high achievers never stop to examine: the difference between being liked and being respected. On the surface, they sound like they're pointing in the same direction. But psychologically, they are almost opposites in how they play out in real life. When you optimize for being liked, you make yourself smaller. You agree more than you actually agree. You swallow comments that deserve to be said. You volunteer for things you don't have time for because the discomfort of saying no feels worse than the exhaustion of saying yes. And here's where it gets interesting from a behavioral psychology standpoint. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's loss aversion research, originally published in 1979 in Econometrica, found that the pain of a potential social loss feels roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of an equivalent gain. So when you're faced with a moment where you could push back or hold a boundary, your nervous system is running the math wrong. It's treating the discomfort of possible disapproval as if it were a threat twice as dangerous as it actually is. You're not weak. Your brain is just doing exactly what it was wired to do. The problem is, the more you let that override your judgment, the more you train the people around you to see your approval as something they don't actually need to earn. Real talk? Likability gives you comfort in the short run. Respect compounds over time. And you cannot have both if you're constantly sacrificing the second one to protect the first. Which brings us to the deeper reason this keeps happening. And it goes all the way down to something called self-image theory. Dr. Maxwell Maltz was a plastic surgeon in the 1950s and 60s who noticed something unsettling about his patients. They would come in, ask him to fix a feature they believed was holding them back, a jawline, a nose, something they were convinced was the reason they weren't taken seriously. He'd perform the surgery, they'd look different, and for a few weeks, sometimes a few months, they'd feel better. Then they'd drift right back to the same patterns of behavior, the same level of confidence, the same social dynamics, because the external change hadn't touched the internal blueprint. He called this self-image, and he argued in his landmark work Psycho-Cybernetics, published in 1960, that it operates like a thermostat for everything you do. You don't behave above your self-image for long, you drift back. What makes this relevant to respect isn't just theory, it connects directly to something social psychologists call self-verification. The subconscious drive we all have for people to see us the way we already see ourselves, if, deep down, you carry a belief that you're not quite someone whose opinion commands weight. You will unconsciously behave in ways that invite exactly that confirmation. You'll hedge your statements, you'll add unnecessary qualifiers, you'll shrink your posture, and the people around you will respond to those cues, not to your actual capability. Take someone like Marcus, a 33-year-old data analyst in Denver making $87,000 a year, 2 promotions in 3 years, leading a team of 6. Every time he walked into a cross-functional meeting, he'd open with the same phrase, "I'm sorry to take up time, but just a quick thought here." He wasn't aware he was doing it. He'd been doing it so long it felt like politeness. But what he was actually broadcasting every single time was, "I'm not sure I belong in this room." And over 18 months of that signal, people had unconsciously adjusted how seriously they took his input. The frustrating part? His ideas were often the sharpest in the room. His delivery was undermining his own competence. What makes this self-verification loop so insidious is that it's invisible from the inside. You genuinely believe you're being professional, humble, approachable. But the people around you aren't reading your intentions. They're reading your behavior. And when your behavior consistently signals uncertainty, the people in your environment will unconsciously fill that vacuum with their own assumptions about your competence. Over time, those assumptions become the shared narrative of the room, not because it's accurate, but because you handed them the pen. The fix doesn't start with better presentations or more strategic visibility. It starts with updating the internal blueprint that's driving those behaviors in the first place, which is exactly why income alone never solves this. You can double your salary, earn a bigger title, add more credentials to your bio, and still walk into a room and broadcast the same self-image you've had since the first time someone made you feel small. The thermostat just resets. This is the piece that most self-improvement content skips entirely, and it's the reason so many high earners still feel fundamentally disrespected, despite every external marker of success. Here's the number that should stop you cold. A 2023 study by researchers at the University of California found that employees rated as low assertiveness were 47% more likely to be passed over for leadership opportunities, even when their performance evaluations were equal to peers rated as high assertiveness. Let that sink in. Same work, same output, same results, different outcome. Because of the perceived confidence signal, not the actual ability. And this isn't a gender or age dynamic the study held across demographics. It's a communication and presence dynamic. The people who get promoted, who get their ideas funded, who get deferred to in meetings, they're not always the smartest people in the room. But they almost always have one thing in common. They take up their allocated space. They don't pre-apologize. They don't soften every statement into a suggestion. They make a claim, they back it up, they hold the floor long enough to let it land. I want to be clear. This is not about being aggressive or domineering. That's a different problem entirely, and we'll get to the assertive versus aggressive distinction in a minute. But being consistently quiet, consistently hedging, consistently deferring in contexts where you've earned the right to speak, that's not politeness. That's a self-image problem wearing a politeness costume. And the longer it goes on, the harder the reset becomes. Before we go further, if this is resonating, if you're watching this and you recognize patterns in yourself you want to actually change, hit subscribe. We go deep on the psychology of performance, money, and self-leadership every week. It's worth staying in the loop. Now let's talk about the specific trap that catches the most high-earning, high-effort people. And this is the one nobody likes to admit to. Behavioral psychologist Dr. Shade Zarai, who spent 5 years doing PhD research on why some people get stuck while others propel forward, describes a pattern she calls the anxious overachiever, someone who has outsourced their sense of self-worth to external validation. In her research, the behavior looks like this. You're productive, you're driven, you have high autonomy, you focus on what you can control, but underneath all of that, there's this quiet, constant anxiety about whether people approve of what you're doing. And it shows up in a very specific set of behaviors. You say yes before the person asking has finished the sentence. You over-apologize for things that didn't require an apology. You soften your opinions until they lose their edge. You volunteer for tasks that cost you more than they benefit you, because saying no felt, in that moment, like a social risk you couldn't afford. Here's my honest take on this, and I know it'll land uncomfortably. What most people call being nice in professional and personal contexts is actually a covert transaction. You're giving people what they want, hoping they'll give you back respect and safety in return. But that's not how respect works. Respect isn't the reward for maximum agreeability. It's the natural byproduct of watching someone hold their own position under pressure. Consider Lauren, a 37-year-old marketing director in Austin. High performer by every metric: budget accountability, team retention, revenue attribution. She made good money, she was widely liked, and she was profoundly overlooked. Every time her executive team was looking for someone to step into a VP conversation, they passed her over. Not because she wasn't qualified. It's because she'd spent 3 years in that organization saying yes to everything, softening every pushback, and absorbing other people's discomfort on their behalf. She told me once, and this is the line I keep thinking about, I thought being accommodating was the same as being valuable. I didn't realize I was making myself invisible. That confusion is not a character flaw. It's a psychology problem with a name, self-verification. She was unconsciously confirming the belief that her value was conditional. Conditional on making everyone around her comfortable. And the people around her had learned to agree. Here's where we get practical. And this is the part of the conversation most people skip because they hear set boundaries and assume it means starting fights. It doesn't. Dr. Zaharai's framework is clean and simple. A boundary is an if-then statement. If this behavior continues, then this is what I'll do. That's it. Most people only ever complete the first half. I don't like being talked over in meetings. Okay, that's not a boundary, that's a preference. A boundary has a consequence attached. If you continue interrupting me, I'm going to start addressing it in the moment, out loud. The consequence doesn't have to be dramatic, it just has to be real. And you have to actually be willing to follow through. Because the first time someone tests you, what you do next is the only signal that matters. Here's what this looks like in practice with someone you genuinely care about. A family member, a close colleague, rather than a stranger. You raise it outside the friction. You say something like, I love you, and I want our relationship to work. When this specific thing happens, it affects me in this way. If it keeps happening, I'm going to have to step back from these interactions for a while. Then you wait. Most people, if they actually care about the relationship, will hear that. They may not respond perfectly in the moment, but they heard it. The key is that you said, when this happens, not when you do this to me. One is about behavior, the other is about blame. And you named a consequence that is proportional and within your control. That last part is critical. Don't promise consequences you won't follow through on. The fastest way to train people that your limits don't mean anything is to state them and then fold anyway. Beyond that, there are two specific micro-habits that shift how people perceive you almost immediately. The first one is the intentional delay. Instead of answering requests in real time, you pause and say something like, thanks for thinking of me. Let me check my calendar and get back to you by end of day. That's not avoidance. That's the behavior of someone whose time has value. You're giving yourself the space to make an intentional decision instead of a reactive one. The second habit is replacing over-apologetic language with language of appreciation. The next time you're running 2 minutes late, instead of I'm so sorry, I apologize, forgive me. Try thank you for your patience. You're acknowledging the same reality without performing self-diminishment. Seemingly small, psychologically completely different signal, and consistency is the whole game here. The ref one principle holds. People don't build a clear picture of who you are from one interaction. They build it from the pattern across dozens of interactions. One confident moment won't override a year of hedging, but 3 months of consistently holding your position, following through on your stated limits, and not collapsing under social pressure. That rewires how people experience you. Here's the part that flips the whole framework upside down. And it's the insight I most wish someone had handed me early on. Most people operate from the belief that respect is a reward. You do the work, you earn the results eventually earn you the respect. That's the sequence, right? Here's the problem. It doesn't work that way. What the research actually shows, and what both the Maxwell-Maltz self-image data and the assertiveness studies confirm, is that respect functions more like a precondition than a reward. People don't decide to respect you after they've evaluated all your credentials. They make a rapid, mostly unconscious judgment about your self-confidence in the first few seconds of an interaction. Then they interpret everything that follows through that initial frame, which means if you walk in already broadcasting insecurity, the data you present afterward is filtered through that initial impression. I'd argue, and I know this cuts against a lot of conventional career advice, that no amount of income, no number of promotions, and no pile of achievements will substitute for this. Money buys access, money buys options, but respect, in the deepest sense, is a psychological contract between you and the people in your environment. You have to actively project it before you can receive it back. This is exactly what James Clear articulates in Atomic Habits, published in 2018, when he writes that every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. Applied here, Every time you enforce a stated limit, every time you hold your position under pressure, every time you take up the space you've earned, you're casting a vote for being someone whose presence changes the room. And every time you fold, you're casting the opposite vote. That's not a moral judgment, it's just behavioral math. The last piece of this is mastery, not generalized competence, but one specific domain where your results are undeniable. The fastest way to project confidence without performing it is to be genuinely, measurably excellent at something narrow enough that you can point to it. Not, I'm good at strategy. That's vague enough to be meaningless, but our campaign conversion rate went from 2.1% to 6.8% in a quarter, and here's the specific mechanism that drove it. That's a credential you can hold. When you have that kind of specificity available to you, you stop needing to apologize before you speak. The conviction comes from the clarity, and the clarity is what other people can feel even before you finish your sentence. The discomfort of changing how you show up, holding a position when someone pushes back, saying no when you want to say yes, enforcing a consequence you promised. The discomfort is temporary. The respect you build through those small, consistent choices is not. It compounds the same way the self-image debt from years of people-pleasing compounded in the other direction. One last thing before you close out. Posture. I want to leave you with something immediately actionable. Research by behavioral scientists studying postural feedback loops, specifically the flexion angle of the neck, found that the simple distance between your chin and your chest meaningfully changes how confident you feel and how you're perceived. Head dropped, neck flexed, insecurity signal, both internally and externally. Chin level, neck long, different state entirely. That's not a life hack. That's your nervous system responding to a physical cue. So the next time you're walking into a hard conversation, a negotiation, a confrontation, a room where you feel like you need to prove yourself, before you say a word, just lengthen that distance. It's a 2-second reset that changes what you're projecting. Next video, we're going into emotional intelligence in leadership, specifically the one habit that separates high EQ leaders from everyone else in a high-pressure environment. It's simpler than you think, and most people never figure it out. I'll see you there.